If the universe had a cause, and the cause of the universe wasn't the universe itself, but an intelligent designer, we must ask ourselves the question that who designed the designer? That designed the designer, 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 that designed the designer. And we could go on and on, or we could simply just ask who designed the designer. This is one question Richard Dawkins, a British evolutionary biologist, asks in his book titled The God Delusion. But before we go further into this objection and dive deeper into this book, let's answer the question that isn't it unscientific to posit God as the beginning of the universe?
Welcome to AJ's Thoughts with Ezekiel, the Unapologetics Bold Apologetics podcast. This is your space to grow in faith, defend what you believe, and respond to hard questions with wisdom and truth. Let's dive in, listen, and be edified.
In answering the question that isn't it unscientific to posit God as the beginning of the universe, it's important to first of all know that no scientific theory starts by saying God did it and that's why this and this happened. Take for instance the Big Bang theory. It doesn't start by saying God spoke the world into existence and the universe began to rapidly expand. No scientific theory starts by saying God did it. In fact, that is why physicists, microbiologists, cosmologists, archaeologists, geologists, and many more scientists in different areas of science investigate, carry out their research, pose theories and hypotheses, trying to understand the origin of the universe and the origin of life. Even though many scientific hypotheses and theories cannot fully or adequately explain what happened before the universe began or how the universe began in the first place, is it not unscientific to include God in filling the gaps of what science doesn't currently know, especially since there is no scientific way of testing out God, like carrying out an experiment in a laboratory? When we look at some of the arguments for intelligent design, like the fine-tuning argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, some philosophical arguments as well, it all points to an intelligent designer. Knowing the attributes of a designer leads to a being with intelligence. And according to philosophy, God is described as the ultimate being that exists. So, posing God as the beginning of the universe is not unscientific or using God to fill the gaps of what is currently unknown to science. It is providing the best explanation, giving the evidences and all the arguments for how the universe originated. Let us take the cosmological argument as an example. The first premise that says whatever begins to exist has a cause can be looked at from a philosophic angle or from a logical observation of how things happen in the universe. From all the evidences available today, the best scientific conclusion on the origin of the universe is that the universe began to exist. Then, from the conclusion of the cosmological argument, the universe had a cause. We would ask ourselves the question, what caused the universe to exist? From the Big Bang theory, time, space, matter all began to exist at once. Therefore, it is logical to believe that whatever caused the universe to exist is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Combined with the fine-tuning argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument, there is a mind behind the universe. Combining all of this points to an ultimate intelligent being, the designer who dwells beyond the physical realm. Further down in this episode, we are going to answer the question, how do we know that the cause of the universe is God? But right now, let's answer two questions. Who designed the designer and who created God? Let's start with who designed the designer. Richard Dawkins wrote a book titled The God Delusion, and the conclusion of the book is that God doesn't exist. The central argument of the book is against the existence of a designer who most people attribute to be God. The argument in his book can be broken down into 6 points, which adds up to make a case for the improbability of a complex designer and the explanatory power of natural processes. Let's start with point number 1, the challenge of explaining complex apparent design. In observing the world around us and the universe at large, from large structures like galaxies to microstructures like cells and subatomic particles, we can observe order, purpose, information, and complexity. All of this points to design. And there is therefore the need to intellectually explain and understand the complexity and statistical improbability of the world appearing to be designed and fine-tuned for life. And this leads to the second point, the temptation of the designer hypothesis. You see, there is the temptation to naturally attribute this appearance of design to an actual conscious designer, whom many people believe to be God. The reason we naturally want to attribute the appearance of design to a designer is because of what we can observe in the world around us. Take for instance, when we see a beautiful piece of artwork, whether it's a drawing, a painting, or a sculpture, we automatically infer that an artist was responsible for the artwork. Whenever we come across an object that appears to be too complex to be naturally occurring, we automatically infer an intelligent being behind the existence of that object. For instance, even if we found a phone or a piece of paper containing a written message on the floor, we automatically infer someone must have dropped it there or misplaced what they owned. We do not just believe that the object happened to appear there all of a sudden by itself. But Richard Dawkins goes on to make his third point, saying that the designer hypothesis is a false temptation. According to Richard Dawkins, the designer hypothesis is non-explanatory in explaining why the world or an object appears to be designed, because this immediately raises a complex problem of who designed the designer, which leads to postulating an even more improbable entity like an ultimate being or a supernatural supreme being or a complex God as a solution for complexity, and this is a circular or self-defeating argument, which Richard Dawkins termed a skyhook fantasy. Let me explain what all of this means. According to Richard Dawkins, if we attribute all of the complexity and apparent design we can see in this universe, attribute it to a designer, we would get into much more complex and circular reasoning in trying to explain the origin of this designer. If we decide to term this designer the ultimate supreme being, then we must ask ourselves, who designed the ultimate designer? Not to talk about the complexity of explaining how the ultimate supreme being designed a complex structure all at once. Richard Dawkins says that the best explanation for the complexity and apparent design we can observe in the universe should be much simpler than a designer or God. Which leads me to the fourth point. Natural selection is the true powerful explanation for biology. According to Richard Dawkins, Darwinian evolution by natural selection provides an ingenious, powerful explanation for biological complexity, showing how apparent design can arise from simple origins without a designer. What Richard Dawkins is simply saying is that it's much easier to explain how various complex living species evolved from much simpler living species or organisms than explaining how a complex designer designed all of these living species with their complexities in a complex world. And so it's much easier to just say there was the existence of a much simpler organism which led to complex living organisms or living species. But this is just in the area of biology. What about the universe at large? And this leads to Dawkins' fifth point. An equivalent explanation for physics is currently lacking but possible. Currently in the field of science, we do not yet have a complete or comprehensive explanation for the fine-tuning we can observe in the universe or the fundamental laws and constraints of physics that guides the universe. But as we all know, science is improving every day. Experiments and research are being carried out to find a naturalistic way of explaining how the universe originated or what led to the Big Bang. And that's why Richard Dawkins' sixth point is hope for a natural explanation in physics. He says that just as powerful as the Darwinian evolution by natural selection was in explaining the complexity of biological and living organisms that exist today, so would a time come when there will be a natural explanation in physics in explaining the complexity and apparent design that we observe in the universe we live in. The overall conclusion drawn from these 6 points is that due to the lack of evidence for a designer and the explanatory power of natural processes, a universe without God is more probable than a universe with God. And the God hypothesis or the designer hypothesis is almost certainly false. Is all of these 6 points or 6 premises given by Richard Dawkins actually correct? The answer is no. However, even if we assume that all 6 premises are correct, the logical conclusion wouldn't be that God doesn't exist or an intelligent designer doesn't exist. Let's focus on point 3. The designer hypothesis is a false temptation, where Richard Dawkins objects to the case for intelligent designer or a complex designer by asking the question, who designed the designer? Dawkins says that you cannot infer a designer of the universe based on the complexity in the universe because this raises a further question, namely, who designed the designer? And therefore, this leaves biological complexity unexplained. My first objection to what Richard Dawkins said would be that the case for intelligent design is not only used to explain the complexity of living species that exist today, but also the fine-tuning we can observe in the universe, the appearance of order, meaning, purpose, and design, as well as the origin of life. Richard Dawkins is also wrong when he says that God cannot be an explanation for the complexity of the universe because God is more complex than the universe, and explaining God requires even more complex explanation. Here are 2 reasons I believe Richard Dawkins is wrong. The first one is that a complex designer can design complex designs. And we can observe this in the world we live in. There are so many man-made things, from small objects like microchips to large structures like rockets and space shuttles. Many of these man-made things have their own form of complexity, as well as the complexity taken into manufacturing or producing or designing these things. On the other hand, human beings are also complex living beings. So this does not mean that when we observe complex man-made objects, we automatically say human beings couldn't have produced, manufactured, or designed these man-made things because human beings are also complex living beings. It's also true that sometimes the more complex an object or a thing looks, the more complexity was involved in the production, manufacturing, or designing of that thing. Even explaining how the thing works might involve some form of complexity as well. The second reason I say Richard Dawkins is wrong is that if all of the evidences supporting the case for intelligent design holds up to be true, then the statement that the universe was intelligently designed by a designer is a sufficient explanation as to why we can observe apparent design in the universe. Let me use this example to illustrate my point. If you were to walk into the dining room of a house and you found all sorts of plates of jollof rice and chicken served ready to be eaten, but the house is empty of any single human being, a sufficient explanation as to why you met food cooked, served, and ready to be eaten in the dining room is that someone prepared or some people prepared the food, served it, and were about to eat, but they left the house. A desire for more explanation, like why did the people leave the house or where did they go to, does not subtract from the sufficiency of the explanation that you met food prepared, served, and ready to be eaten in the house because someone or a group of people prepared, served, and were about to eat the food. Questions like who actually prepared the food, how many people were involved in preparing the food, what is their culinary skills, require additional explanation, but does not diminish the sufficiency of the explanation as to why you met food that had been prepared, served, and ready to be eaten. This is the same way that in the case of biological complexity or the complexity we can observe in the universe, in order to recognize that intelligent design or an intelligent designer is the best explanation, you don't need to be able to explain fully the designer. This can be left as an open-ended question for future inquiry. This does not mean that further explanation like who the designer is or how the designer designed the universe is irrelevant. This just requires separate explanations from why we can observe apparent design, like fine-tuning, order, purpose, and complexity in the universe. Philosophers of science believe that in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. The explanation given must be able to sufficiently stand on its own as an answer to the question, with further explanation given when new questions are asked. Dawkins believes that an explanation has to be simpler than the phenomenon you are trying to explain. And that's why he believes that the Darwinian evolution by natural selection, explaining how complex living species originated from simpler living organisms, is the best explanation for biological complexity. But one question I would like to ask Richard Dawkins is that does he have a simpler scientific proven explanation as to how the first living organism originated? One that is simpler than explaining how complex living species evolved from simple living organisms. So the question, who designed the designer, is a valid question but an invalid objection to the case of intelligent design, which says the universe was intelligently designed by a designer. Let's move to the next question. Who made God, or who created God? And this is quite different from the earlier question, who designed the designer? The question who designed the designer was treated as an objection to the case of intelligent design. But the question who made God is treated as an honest question in view of the cosmological argument that says whatever began to exist has a cause. If the universe began to exist and we believe the cause of the universe is God, what about God? Did God begin to exist, and who made God? Let's start with what science leads us to conclude about God. According to the Big Bang Theory, which is the most widely accepted theory on how the universe began, time, space, and matter all began at once. Matter represents the physical realm of all that we can observe with our five senses. That is what we can see, hear, taste, smell, or touch. If God created time, space, and matter, it means that God is timeless, an eternal being, and an eternal being cannot have a cause. Keith Ward, in his book, God, Chance, and Necessity, says if one asks what caused God, the answer is that nothing could bring into being a reality which wholly transcends space and time and which is self-existent. The cosmological argument leads us to the existence of a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, uncaused eternal being. God is eternal and timeless. He has no beginning because he didn't begin to exist. Since he didn't begin to exist, he has no need for a cause. The concept of God is the concept of an eternal, self-existent, necessary being. And therefore, the answer to the question, who made God or who created God, is simply that God is uncaused. God is self-existent. This is all that science and philosophy can tell us about the question, who made God or who created God. Science cannot carry out an experiment on anything or an entity that exists beyond time, space, and matter. But what about from a religious point of view? There are so many religions in this world, all or some of them having a God as the supreme being they worship. Some of those religions have sacred texts containing information or things they know and believe about their God. But for this podcast, AJ's Thoughts with Ezekiel, we are going to answer this question from what the Bible has to say when we begin the episodes on Christianity's creator of creation. So keep listening to AJ's Thoughts with Ezekiel. Right now, let me answer our last question on the case for intelligent design. How do we know the cause of the universe is God? From the cosmological argument, we understand that the cause of the universe has to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. The cause of time and space is timeless, meaning it dwells outside time and space. And whatever dwells outside time and space is changeless, meaning is not subject to change. Whatever doesn't change is immaterial because physical or material things are constantly changing, even down to a quantum level. Every physical or material thing is subject to change. We can also say that the cause of the universe has to be uncaused because there cannot be an infinite number of causes to an event. It had to have started from an uncaused cause. The cause of the universe must be unimaginably powerful since it created the universe from no material substance. The cause of the universe itself created energy and matter. The cause of the universe is also a personal creator. Here is how we can prove that the cause of the universe is a personal creator. Since the cause of the universe is timeless and the universe itself is not timeless. This means the cause of the universe made a decision to create a new effect, not necessarily because of its cause. The cause of the universe made a conscious decision to cause the universe, not because the cause exists, but because the cause has the will and ability to do so. We know that every cause has an effect. If the cause is timeless, but the effect is not timeless, it means that there was a time when the cause existed without the effect. But then the cause decided to create or cause a new effect based on its free will. And only a personal being has a consciousness and ability to do or not do something. This is known as free will. And only living beings have free will. Combining all of the qualities of the cause of the universe points to a supreme, eternal, all-powerful personal creator who many consider as God, even though we all believe different things about this God. In our next episode, we are going to look at what or who science and philosophy say is the designer. We are also going to look at various religious worldviews of who the designer or designers, God or council of gods are, and what they believe about how the universe was created. Thank you so much for listening to the end of this episode. Remember, you can follow me on social media on Instagram and TikTok at Ezekiel. The Ezekiel is spelled Ezekarel. If you have questions, you can send me a DM. Don't forget to share this podcast episode on your social media status with your friends, with your family, and those who you know need to give this episode a listen. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. Keep listening to AJ Sports with Ezekiel.